Karl Marx, in his 1848 Communist Manifesto, overtly and proudly proclaimed to the world, "The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims." The communists, following the example of their phrenological master, have openly and endlessly declared culture, that is, music, art, and literature, to be in their sphere of weaponry. Moses Dechter, in the Profile of Communism, admits the communist endeavor to capture men's minds through the cultural offensive. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, stated that the communists have infiltrated every conceivable sphere of activity: youth groups, radio, television, motion picture industries, church, school, educational, and cultural groups. In the musical arena, the marginal neuter might well congratulate the revolutionary socialists for their successful use of music, for inflicting upon the American public a program announced beforehand and persistently pursued until near perfection and completion. The communist infiltration into the subversion of American music has been nothing short of phenomenal, and in some areas, for example, folk music, their control is fast approaching the saturation point under the able leadership of Pete Seeger. The importance of folk music perhaps has been best summarized by Andrew Fletcher, who in 1704 stated, quote, "I knew a very wise man who believed that if a man were permitted to make all the ballads, he need not care who should make the laws of a nation." And we find that most of the ancient legislators thought they could not well reform the manners of any city without the help of a lyric and sometimes of a dramatic poet. In 1929, a group of Russian musicians met in Moscow and drew up a platform entitled "The Ideological Platform of the Russian Association of Proletarian Musicians." It was republished in a book entitled Music Since 1900, and this happens to be the first edition, 1937. Their program was twofold. Number one, classical music was bourgeois. That is, it was impossible to have a revolution with classical music. Their second point, however, was perhaps more important. Folk music could very well be an instrument for a communist society. Nikolai Lenin would not listen to classical music. Maxim Gorky asked him at one time why he would not listen, and his answer was, "I can't smash heads together and listen to that type of music." But their point was that folk music somehow could be an instrument to establish a communist society. And that conclusion was found on page 555. For the communist influence and subversion of American folk music was started in 1946. At least this is a date that we can use for historical purposes. It goes before that, of course, but for our purposes, 1946, perhaps the end of 1945 is as good as any. In that year, an organization was set up entitled People's Songs Incorporated. People's Songs Incorporated was investigated by the Senate Fact-Finding Committee of the state of California in 1949. And in their fifth report put out by the state of California, I read on page 544, "Your committee finds that People's Songs is a vital communist front." Well, with the citation, People's Songs went into the woodwork and came back out under a brand new name entitled People's Artists Incorporated. But in 1951, the federal government, in its Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications for May 14, on page 94, cited People's Artists Incorporated as a subversive organization. So once again, they changed their name. And this time they came back out under Sing Out Incorporated. And this is presently their particular name. They have a publication called Sing Out, the folk song magazine, edited by Irwin Silber, who has been identified under oath as having been a member of the Communist Party in 1952. The publication Sing Out is presently being published by Oak Publications. So there are four things that we want to remember as far as organizations are concerned: People's Songs Incorporated, People's Artists Incorporated, Sing Out Incorporated, and Oak Publication. Now, the key personality behind this whole scheme to subvert and infiltrate American folk music was the executive secretary of People's Songs, Inc. He's a very famous individual. I saw him on television for a full hour not too long ago. He came back from Moscow last fall with some good news for the Reds. He's been entertaining the communists in this country for nearly 25 years, and he appears on most of our major university and college campuses. And I'm referring to none other than Mr. Pete Seeger. Now, to begin with, Pete Seeger has been identified under oath as having been a member of the Communist Party. This citation was given in the year 1952. You will find it in the House Committee on Un-American Activities annual report, and his name is mentioned on page 72. It seems that an FBI agent surfaced, gave his testimony under oath, and listed 400 or nearly 400 individuals. For example, I see here immediately the name of Herbert Aptheker. Most are familiar with Mr. Aptheker at the present time. He's one of the leading communist theoreticians in the country. And then, of course, Pete Seeger is listed as an official of People's Songs Incorporated. Now, for those who were keeping up with the activities of Pete Seeger, this came as no surprise. However, there's still a great deal of effort to cover over this particular citation. In the early 40s, Seeger set up a singing group called the Almanac Singers. In the Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications for December the 1st, 1961, and by the way, this is the latest guide that we have available from our federal government, on page 16, the Almanac Singers are cited as subversive with just two words, communist entertainers, quote unquote. Of course, you don't hear too much about the Almanac Singers anymore unless you take Scholastic's magazine's list of last year for our grade schools. Today they go under the name The Weavers. And I noticed that a publishing company just recently printed their Return to Carnegie Hall. In 1961, Pete Seeger was again cited as subversive in the annual report of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And on page 43, and I'm reading, the case of Pete Seeger, the folk singer, offers another example of the type of assistance the U.S. Communist Party receives from abroad. Seeger, as mentioned before, has been identified as a member of the Communist Party. In the annual report of the House Committee for 1962, on page 27, I read, identified Communist Party member Pete Seeger was listed among persons scheduled to perform. So this is our friend, Mr. Seeger. News and Views in July 1965, News and Views out of Wheaton, Illinois, listed just the communist fronts of Pete Seeger, and it took them 12 pages, single space, just to enumerate his communist front background. And yet, with all of this said, we still have religious groups who are using Seeger as their chief entertainer. For example, in 1965, the International Walther League of the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church actually had Pete Seeger entertain their 3,200 young people in Squaw Valley, California. Some say, well, he didn't influence anyone. Well, I have some bad news. In 1 month later, in August of 1965, these same young people met at St. Paul's College in Concordia, Missouri, and they passed out a little booklet entitled, Let Love Be Genuine. And on page 12, the third vice president of the organization said, if only more leaguers, pastors, and adults could have been there to hear Mr. Seeger testify. And then he also said this, Mr. Seeger's devotion to the United States of America must not be challenged anymore. 2 months later, with this bone still in our throat, by the way, that is that we can't challenge his devotion to our country, 2 months later, Seeger appears in Moscow. And here's a New York Times, Chicago Tribune wire service. Pete Seeger sang a Vietnam protest ballad before an auditorium full of Moscow University students. Its bitterness was aimed at the American military presence in Vietnam. It refers to the soldiers' feelings of hopelessness in the war, his doubts about the loyalty of the men in his unit. By the way, that was in the Chicago Tribune for October 25th, 1965. Now, one sad note here is the fact that a sergeant in Thailand wrote his congressman just last month and protested the fact that Pete Seeger's albums were being sold in Army and Air Force service exchange centers in Vietnam and Saigon and in Thailand. And I have before me a letter from the Department of the Army actually mentioning the fact that Seeger's communist affiliations are only alleged. I would suggest to these young people one little thing. Instead of sitting at Seeger's socks and singing Seeger's songs, why not form a committee to ship Seeger to Siberia? And if you need some editorial comment, I have it here in the Knoxville Journal of October 26, 1965, one day after they found out Seeger was in Moscow. Here's the last paragraph. There is doubtless great rejoicing, says the editorial, among Pete Seeger's old-time associates that he has had this triumphal tour of treason. in a country where most of us wish that all good American communists would go to take up permanent residence. Now, Pete Seeger was the key, and we don't have time to go into his full background, but this is enough to at least give us a little inkling. Usually when I mention these facts to college and university students, they all say, well, those are government reports, and you can't believe government reports. Usually I take this publication entitled American Favorite Ballads, Tunes and Songs as Sung by Pete Seeger, and it says here an Oak publication along with me to buttress my point. On page 38, listen to this. Working men of all tongues unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. You have a world to win. Viva la socialistic revolution. That's from our friend Pete Seeger. Sounds like Karl Marx' 1848 Communist Manifesto. Now, there are other ones that are involved in this overall scheme to infiltrate and subvert American folk music. The second one that we should pay our respects to is our friend Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie has been identified under oath as having been a member of the Communist Party, and I have this government report in front of me, and it even mentions the fact that for many years he was a columnist for the Daily Worker. He wrote a column called Woody Says. Thirdly, we should mention Erwin Silber. Erwin Silber has also been identified under oath as a member of the Communist Party, and presently he is the editor of Sing Out magazine. I have the House Committee's report entitled The Communist Party's Cold War Against Congressional Investigations of Subversion, and on page 1480 I read, Sing Out is edited by Erwin Silber, who was identified as a member of the Communist Party in testimony given this committee in 1952. An associate editor of the magazine is Pete Seeger, who has also been identified as a party member. The magazine frequently features favorite Communist Party songs and newly composed party line lyrics. And that's an understatement. Frequently is a bad word. Practically exclusively. Number 4 is Jerry Silverman. Jerry Silverman is presently translating Russian folk songs into English. And I notice in the Four Continent Book Corporation for February 1964, and by the way, on the front cover of this pamphlet it says Imported Records of the USSR. And Four Continent Book Corporation was also investigated by the House Committee in 1963 and found to be importing communist propaganda into the country and also buying our U.S. patents in Washington for 25 cents and shipping them to the USSR. But in this brochure, it mentions the fact that Silverman is, quote, translating 44 Russian folk songs and popular songs with lyrics into English. We'll come back to Jerry Silverman just a little bit later. Next, we should pay our respects to Moses Ash. Moses Ash is co-owner and co-publisher of Sing Out and founder and director of Folkways Records. Folkways Records, as we're going to notice in a few minutes, is perhaps the single largest pro-communist disking company in the United States of America. And then briefly, 2 women. Sis Cunningham has been identified under oath as a member of the Communist Party in hearings in the Detroit area, February 1952. She is the editor of Broadside of New York. Broadside was formed by Sis Cunningham, Pete Seeger, and Malvina Reynolds. Malvina Reynolds has also been identified under oath as a member of the Communist Party. Carl Prussian, in his Heads Up for April 64, says, she has been part of the communist conspiracy all her life. She was born into it. Her father was a chartered member of the Communist Party. She herself was a member of the Young Pioneers, the Young Communist League, and finally the Communist Party affiliated to the Communist Internationale. So this is the background. This is the ball team that we're talking about. They're all in left field. They're all pitching southpaw. They're all batting left-handed. And yet, in 20 years, from 1946 to 1966 or 67, what have they accomplished? Well, let's just briefly take a look. I have before me the American Broadcasting Company TV's Hootenanny Songbook. As you know, ABC put on a program entitled Hootenanny. They barred Pete Seeger. But listen, the editor of this publication is Erwin Silber. The musical editor is Jerry Silverman. And on the front cover of the publication, these are the people that we find in the publication itself, the key personalities. Pete Seeger, Peggy Seeger, Mike Seeger's singing group, Ewan McCall. Ewan McCall is Peggy Seeger's husband. And by the way, he resides in London, England. He's been trying for 5 years to get a visa into this country, but the State Department, and I know you might not believe this, but the State Department will not give him a visa because he's too red. Then we have here Woody Guthrie and others. In the back of the book, We're told that if you like these records, if you like the songs, you can purchase them on record from Folkways Records. That's Moses Ash. And one of the more uplifting songs in this whole publication is found on page 132. Lo and behold, it's Jerry Silverman's translation of a Russian folk song entitled Moscow Nights. Listen, promise me my love, he says, as the dawn appears and the darkness turns to light, that you'll cherish dear through the passing years this most beautiful Moscow night. Well, I can hear some of you parents say, I'm not going to purchase that one for my child. I'm going to purchase this one instead. This book here is entitled Young Folk Songbook. It's published by Simon & Schuster. The book is dedicated to Woody Guthrie. The introduction is by Pete Seeger, and on the next page we have a picture of both of them together, Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. And then on page 12 we have a new personality, Earl Robinson. Earl has also been identified under oath as having been a member of the Communist Party and is presently with the Metropolitan Music School in New York City. You'll find the Metropolitan Music School in your latest guide to subversive organizations and publications. Now, who do we have as the key personalities here? Number one at the top is Joan Baez. Joan Baez is an admitted disciple of Pete Seeger's. And if you like to have her basic feeling in a hurry, it was printed on the front page of Fact magazine for January 65. And here's what it says, quote, "The Star-Spangled Banner is just so much trash. Joan Baez." Those of you who remember the Berkeley riots in 1964 will also remember that Mario Savio, Bettina Aptheker, and Joan Baez were the leaders of that little group. Of course, when she led those 814 into Sproul Hall, she went out the back door for fearing that the impending arrest might hurt her, quote, reputation. Number two on the list here of the Young Folk Songbook is Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan is the number one influence on our young people today. If you would take a look at the Saturday Evening Post for July 30th, 1966, you will find Bob Dylan smack on the front cover. And by the way, if you took a look at it, you'd wonder, just cover up his face, and it looks like you'd have a hard time telling if it were a he, she, or it. Bob Dylan has been part of the Sis Cunningham broadside movement since its inception. And I have broadside here with me. This is number 57, April 10th, 65. It mentions the fact that Sis Cunningham is the editor, Pete Seeger is the advisor, and one of the contributing editors is Bob Dylan. In February of 1966, the Des Moines Register asked Bob what kind of girls he liked. Now listen to his answer. Now this is the number one influence in American young people today. Quote, "I want my woman dirty looking as though I just found her in some alley." Dirt is very attractive. It triggers the animal emotion. I want dirty long hair hanging all over the place. I hate shaved legs or arms. I hate astringent lotions because those antiseptic smells revolt me. I hate girls who like Rock Hudson. Now, how's that for the number one influence in our young people today? And by the way, the liberal Des Moines Register even made this comment. Now, would you want a man like that to marry your Cocker Spaniel? Now, that's our friend Bob Dylan. Not fit to marry the household pet, and yet fit to influence the psyche of millions of our teenagers today. And then, of course, we have Mike Seeger's group. This is on the Young Folk Songbook again. We have Mike Seeger's singing group, and at the end we have Peggy Seeger. Here's a bright-colored folk song book. It's entitled 104 Folk Songs, compiled by Moses Ash. Who do we have here? Pete Seeger. This is the front cover now. Pete Seeger, Peggy Seeger, Mike Seeger, Ewan McCall, Peggy Seeger's husband, the New Law City Ramblers, Mike Seeger's singing group, Woody Guthrie, Guy Carroll Wan of the Highlander Folk School, and more of that later, and Cisco Houston, who's also been identified under oath as a member of the Communist Party. Now, here's another publication that's on our newsstands at the present time. It's called the Rock Folk Song Folio. I have all three publications here, but in their first volume, they featured, guess who? Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan. Now, on page 23, now this is volume 1, number 1, the very first edition, they mention the fact that Joan Baez contends her favorite folk singer is Phil Ochs. That's spelled O-C-H-S. The other day when we were in Scranton, Pennsylvania, I picked up 2 albums by Phil Ochs, both printed and both disced by Elektra. One is entitled I Ain't Marching Anymore. And on the back we're told, now listen to this. This is how they introduce the record. or the song on the record. This borders, that is the song I Ain't Marching Anymore, this borders between pacifism and treason, combining the best qualities of both. And he's also the author of Draft Dodger Rag. But on the other album that I picked up, entitled Phil Ochs in Concert, on the back of the album we have a group of poems set out. And after one reads the poems, one asks himself, who wrote these poems? And lo and behold, the poems are actually written by Mao Zedong. And Phil Ochs makes the closing comment, is this the enemy? On this album you will find such greats as Ringing of the Revolution, Cops of the World, Canons of Christianity, and others. This is Phil Ochs. This is supposed to be the greatest single influence now on Joan Baez, who is the #1 female influence on our young people today. And you will find this in the Rock Folk Song Folio. I should have mentioned a little bit earlier that Pete Seeger's latest album on Columbia Records is entitled Dangerous Songs. And here we have such great dangerous songs, sung now by Pete Seeger as The Draft Dodger Rag, Phil Ochs wrote that, and Mao Zedong. Also, of course, he has here Beans in My Ears. You say, well, what's so controversial about Beans in My Ears? Well, Beans in My Ears was written by Len Chandler, who is a contributing editor to Broadside magazine. And not too long ago, Sing Out mentioned the fact that many public health departments were banning Beans in My Ears by Len Chandler because children were actually going home, putting beans in their ears, only to have the beans grow and break their eardrums. So this is some of the material that we're discussing, and we'll continue with our discussion on the communist use of folk music. Once upon a time, in a very, very near country, there was a respectable publishing firm that printed books for 3rd and 4th grade children. One extremely popular publication was a folk song book. The children loved its colorful art and its handsome appearance. They also enjoyed singing its many songs which contained such uplifting little verses as, he had the dope habit and he had it bad. Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout and revive us again. The copper bosses killed you, Joe. They killed you, says I. Medalins, medalins, through you heroes now are treading. Red Army heroes of the nation, heroes of the mighty Red Army. We'll shout aloud, for we are proud. Our power is invincible. We'll ne'er disband, we'll always stand together for dear Moscow's land. The once upon a time in the above Wonderland story is now. The near country is indeed near, the United States of America. The publishing firm is Simon & Schuster, and the children's folk song book, in reality, is the Fireside Book of Folk Songs. The Fireside Book of Folk Songs is one of the more exciting volumes used in many of our public and private grade school systems. The volume is beautifully bound with excellent style and art reproductions. However, even though obviously published for children, it contains selections that do not fill the eyes, the ears, and the heart with pleasure, as we are assured on the jacket. For reasons previously known only to Foggy Dew, the book mentions and glorifies dope, illicit sex, copper bosses, bums, and reds. Russian, Chinese, Spanish, Ukrainian, and American varieties, by the way. Willie the Weeper, we're told, according to the Fireside book, makes his living as a chimney sweeper. His only trouble? He had the dope habit. He had the dope habit, and he had it bad, the children are told. And by the way, this is on page 54 and 55 of the 11th edition of the Fireside Book of Folk Songs. On Saturday night, Willie went down to the dope house and smoked a dozen pills or more, we're told. When Willie landed in New York, he got funny, and his girl began to shout, because, as the ballad goes, the dope gave out. Leaving Willie for the head shrinkers and marijuana squads, the apex of the Do-Nothing Society is portrayed as King Bum. Why don't I work like other men do? Asks the star performer. How the blank can I work when the skies are so blue? He rejoins. Taking a swipe at a gospel song, the chorus rejoins, Hallelujah, I'm a bum. Hallelujah, bum again. Hallelujah, give us a handout and revive us again. You'll find that gem on page 102 and 103. The children, if handled with tender, loving care, are then introduced to careless love. The young female, wearing her apron low, is followed through rain and snow by her Don Juan. He finally catches her, only to place the poor young thing in a terrible predicament. She now has to wear her apron high. You see, she's pregnant, and sorrowfully groans, "Oh, it's love, oh, careless love. You see what careless love has done." The portrait accompanying this ditty paints the young male walking away, leaving the blossoming gal behind. A real thriller for sixth graders, and this is on page 46 and 47. Playing on the same theme of illicit love is Fireside's The Foggy, Foggy Dew. The story centers about a bachelor at a weaver's trade, whose only mistake was wooing a fair young maid. It seems one night she threw her arms around his neck, began to weep and tear her hair. What could the old man do but, all night long, hold her in my arms, just to keep her from the foggy, foggy dew, we're told. The next scene shows the old man with his young son lamenting and stating, "Every single time I look into his eyes, he reminds me of the fair young maid, and the many, many times that I held her in my arms just to keep her from the foggy, foggy dew." Jettisoning both Careless Lug and Foggy Dew with the local vice squads, the child is next treated to Joe Hill. The music he is appraised is by Earl Robinson. What he is not told is that Mr. Robinson is a faculty member at the Metropolitan Music School, a school, quote, controlled by communists, unquote, and has himself been identified under oath as having been a member of the Communist Party. The song, Joe Hill, is prefaced with the following remarks. Now, this is for our grade school children. Quote, "Joe Hill, a great labor organizer and poet, was executed in 1915 on a murder charge, which Union circles have always considered a frame-up. Apart from the obvious question as to which Union circles, the unsuspecting child is not informed that Joe Hill was an organizer for the old IWW, the forerunner of the Communist Party, USA, and still on the Attorney General's list of active subversive organizations." The volume Songs of Joe Hill was originally published by the Subversive People's Artists Incorporated and includes some of his best compositions. For example, listen to Pie in the Sky. "Long-haired preachers come out every night, try to tell you what's wrong and what's right, but when asked about something to eat, they will answer with voices so sweet, you will eat by and by in that glorious land above the sky. Work and pray, live on hay. You'll get pie in the sky when you die. That's a lie." In his ballad, Should I Ever Be a Soldier, Joe Hill contends, "We're spending billions every year for guns and ammunition. Our Army and our Navy dear to keep in good condition, while millions live in misery and millions die before us." He says, "Don't sing My Country 'Tis of Thee." I guess that'd be too patriotic. "But sing this little chorus, Should I ever be a soldier, 'neath the red flag I would fight." In a vicious parody on the gospel hymn, "There is Power in the Blood of the Lamb," Joe Hill writes, "If you've had enough of the blood of the Lamb, then join the grand industrial band. If for a change you would have eggs and ham, then come, do your share like a man." His famous The Rebel Girl was actually dedicated to the late Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a former officer of the Communist Party, USA. Oddly enough, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, AFL-CIO, still persist in using Earl Robinson's Joe Hill, and even the Catholic Young Christian Workers Songbook has this ballad praising Joe Hill. As the child continues to travel through the colorful folk songbook, his or her eyes will eventually light upon a brightly painted red flag. The red flag, oddly enough, contains a hammer and sickle, and the song it depicts is innocuously entitled Medellins. The lyrics, however, are not so innocent. "Medellins, Medellins, through you heroes now are treading," we read. "Red Army heroes of the nation, heroes of the mighty Red Army." This is the very army which William Z. Foster, former head of the Communist Party, said would someday assure a Soviet America. Medellins is also to be found in the People's Songbook, originally published by Bonnie and Gere. Since then, it has been published by People's Artists Incorporated, Sing Out Incorporated, and now by Oak Publications. In another selection entitled Moscow, found on page 206 of the Fireside Book, the children are informed that the song, now listen to this, is one of the stirring Red Army songs that have come to us from the Soviet Union. Pray tell, where else would it come from? And here's how it closes. "We'll always stand together for dear Moscow's land." How's that for a good 6th grade class? Tachanka is also included in this volume. It is introduced with the following remarks. A tachanka is a 4-wheeled farm wagon much used in the Ukraine. During the Civil War, the partisans set up in it any kind of gun or weapon they could get hold of, and thus improvised a sort of mobile firepower, which for the first time offset the traditional and historical cavalry superiority of the Cossacks and the regular Tsarist army. So it has a sentimental and class significance to the Soviets. End of quote. Folk songs written during Khrushchev's death purges of the Ukraine are significantly missing. Come Fellow Workers is a Red Chinese song. This song, states Fireside, according to Zilphia Horton of the Highlander Folk School, Mount Eagle, Tennessee, is one which she learned about 6 years ago from Miss Cora Deng, who at that time was head of the industrial division of the YWCA in China. She in turn learned it from the Chinese industrial workers. I bet she did. The Highlander Folk School was organized by Don West and Miles Horton. West was identified under oath as having been a district director of the Communist Party in North Carolina. Miles Horton was identified by John T. Frey, president of the Metal Trades Department of the AFL, as one of the persons who, quote, attended a secret convention in North Carolina, at which time plans were made for spreading the revolutionary theories throughout the South, end of quote. When asked to become a member of the Communist Party, Horton replied, I am doing you just as much good now as I would if I were a member of the Communist Party, end of quote. Miles' wife, Zilphia, was reported by a former honorary member of the Red Army to be more pro-communist than her husband. In analyzing Simon & Schuster's Fireside Book of Folk Songs, one immediately senses the strategy of interspersing these perverted ballads and red songs throughout the work. The circumstantial evidence almost compels one to deliberate with that most disconcerting question, could this really be another subtle plan to subvert our children? Young People's Records and Children's Record Guild records, as you'll recall, were also dressed in beautiful colors, but medical experts found the records to be mentally diseased discs. Just who, therefore, designed, produced, and copyrighted the Fireside Book of Folk Songs? According to Fireside's copyright page, the book was designed and produced by the Sandpiper Press and the Artists and Writers Guild. Published by Simon & Schuster, Rockefeller Center, New York 20. Copyrighted 1947 by Simon & Schuster and the Artists and Writers Guild. Amazingly enough, the latest guide to subversive organizations and publications released by the federal government lists the Artists and Writers Guild as subversive, referring to it as organized by, quote, communists, end of quote. You'll find this in the Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications, December the 1st, 1961, on page 208. Could this be the reason why our little children are made to suffer through dope, illicit sex, bums, and such red pieces as Joe Hill, Moscow, Medellins? We happen to think it is, and would remind our friends of Christ's words. But whoso shall offend one of these little ones which believe in me, it were better for him that a millstone were hanged about his neck, and that he were drowned in the depths of the sea. Christ doesn't sound much like a pacifist there, does it? Christians and all real Americans who love their sons and daughters cannot remain silent much longer. Dante portrayed the hottest places in hell for those who in times of moral crises did nothing. Our silence would not only be unchristian, but cowardly, and a sign of utter capitulation to the enemy. Our immediate action, therefore, tempered with knowledge, wisdom, and love, is of the utmost importance. In June 1965, McCall's magazine came forth with an article entitled Sight and Sound. They admitted the fact that a new sound was going to go across the land. Guess who was going to sing it? Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger, Peter, Paul and Mary, and Ted Bickle. Reader's Digest in April 1965 had an article on folk music, and it ended up praising Woody Guthrie, Bob Dylan, and Malvina Reynolds. Longines Sinfonet Recording Society has been publishing good music, not just folk music, but good music for nearly 50 years. And yet they're coming out with an album entitled The 50 Greatest Folk Singers, Legendary Folk Songs. Guess who's doing it for them? Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, Leadbelly, Joan Baez, The Weavers, Mike Seeger, Phil Ochs. Phil Ochs, as we recall, wrote I Ain't Marching Anymore, Draft Dodger Rag, Ringing of the Revolution. Book of the Month Club is publishing a volume entitled American Folk Singers. The Weavers were told, Pete Seeger, Mike Seeger, Joan Baez, Doc Watson, Gene Rich. Columbia Records is disking folk music, and for them it's Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, Pete Seeger. By the way, the head man at Columbia, at least in the folk field, is John Hammond. And John Hammond, if you'll check him in Appendix 9, has at least a dozen communist fronts behind his name. No wonder Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, and Joan Baez have direct entree to Columbia Records. Now, earlier we mentioned the fact that Moses Ash was founder and director of a record company. The name of that record company, Folkways Records. Now, Folkways Records is a very important record company to keep in your mind. I have before me a newsletter from Folkways Records. Folkways has a very energetic program of placing their records in our public high schools across the country. You say, well, that takes a lot of money. Where are they getting it from? Well, here's the answer. Now listen to this. The federal government has recently made additional funds available to schools through the expanded National Defense Education Act. And Folkways records are on most lists of approved materials. Who's financing Folkways? They're being financed in part by you, the American taxpayer. Scholastics Magazine, Incorporated, has now entered into a working relationship with Folkways Records. Now notice the strategy here. The finances are now available. Now the question is how to put Folkways into the school systems. What better way than to hook up with Scholastics Magazine? I have before me a letter from Scholastic sent out to high school teachers across this nation. Here's the first paragraph. Scholastic is now the exclusive educational distributor for Folkways Records. And here's the P.S. at the bottom. Folkways Records are eligible for purchase under the provisions of the National Defense Education Act. I have before me the order form for Folkways Records sent out by Scholastic. In fact, at the top it says, Scholastic Order Form for Folkways Records. In their 1966 catalog, they actually admit the fact that the labels are now going to be entitled Folkways Scholastic Records label. In 1965, they sent out a catalog of music available from Scholastic, and it happens to be the Folkways Records catalog. Now listen. In the back of this publication, we have the recording artists listed. Some of these names you're familiar with already, at least by now. Pete Seeger, Peggy Seeger, Mike Seeger, the Seeger family. Now, how's that for keeping it in the family? Earl Robinson, Malvina Reynolds. Now, look, Earl Robinson has been identified under oath as having been a member of the Communist Party. Malvina Reynolds has been identified under oath as having been a member of the Communist Party. Pete Seeger here, he has also been identified under oath as having been a member of the Communist Party. The Almanac Singers were told. They were cited as subversive in the latest guide to subversive organizations and publications. Woody Guthrie is mentioned in here. Frank Hamilton, Lee Hayes, Cisco Houston, even Langston Hughes, author of Goodbye Christ. Remember that infamous poem, Move Away From Here Now, Make Room for a Real Guy, Marx, Lenin, Me? By the way, Langston Hughes is also the author of Put One More S in the USA to Make It Soviet. One more S in the USA. Oh, we'll live to see it yet. And for those of you who aren't quite sure about Langston, I have before me one of his poems entitled Ballad of Lenin. Comrade Lenin of Russia, high in a marble tomb. Move over, Comrade Lenin, and give me room. That's Langston Hughes. By the way, the National Council of Churches recommended his books above all other single authors. In other words, he had 9 recommended books on the National Council of Churches, a Negro American reading list. On page 17 of the Folkways Records catalog, we have such jewels as Songs of the USSR Revolution. There you can listen to such greats as the Internationale, the Red Flag, for the power of the Soviets. The Soviet Army is the most powerful of all. If you don't like the House Committee, they even have one here for you. The Un-American Activities Committee. Witch Hunters Go Home, I Like Freedom, Go Back Where You Came From, all in the jacket of the record. We also have the songs of the Algerian freedom fighters. How's that? Holden Roberto's group. Holden was trained in Prague, Czechoslovakia, and I guess he learned his lessons well. In Algeria, he put people through buzzsaws feet first. Black, white, mulatto. His only primary color was red. Then also in this catalog, we have the songs of Hans Eisler. Some of you are familiar with his brother Gerhard, who was the #1 Soviet spy in this country, I guess, until Abel came along. If you'll take a look in the record album itself, you will find a poem by Hans Eisler. And in there he tells everyone to raise high the Soviet hammer and sickle. How's that? And all thanks to scholastic Folkways and the federal government's finances. Now, of course, Folkways hasn't rested, believe me. They have now entered into a working relationship with a huge disking firm in North Hollywood, California. And the announcement was carried in the Billboard magazine of August the 21st, 1965, and on page 3 we're told, Verve Folkways, the label that came into being as a result of a distribution deal between Moses Ash's Folkways Records, and listen to this, and the MGM organization. That is the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer organization. So you have to at least tip your hats to these people. They're not allowing grass to grow under their feet. But this is at least a pretty fair indication of the communist influence, infiltration, and subversion of American folk music. Now, there's one song that is being sung across the country. You know, in 1854, Henry David Thoreau made this statement. Even music, he said, may be intoxicating. Such apparently slight causes destroyed Greece and Rome and will destroy England and America. That was 1854. 100 years later, a little more than 100 years later, we find Watts. We find Chicago, Cincinnati, New York. We find Jacksonville and other American cities being put to the torch. Now in Watts, as thousands of people were in the streets and people were throwing Molotov cocktails into store windows and into buildings, thousands of young people were singing a disc jockey slogan, "Burn, baby, burn." When they came to Chicago this year, and who knows what they're going to do this coming year, they sang, "Burn, baby, burn, and we shall overcome." Now, isn't this odd? As Watts was burning, all the radio stations in Los Angeles took off the air "Eve of Destruction," that little vicious rock and folk song. Music important? I knew a very wise man who believed that if a man were permitted to make all the ballads, he need not care who should make the laws of the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my thesis that the communists, since at least 1946, have entered upon a planned program to subvert American folk music. This is just part of the evidence, and the balance of the evidence can be had for a reading of Rhythm Riots and Revolution, distributed by Christian Crusade in Tulsa, Oklahoma.